For should we start?
Greeting to everyone with us. On behalf of the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas, I would like to welcome you to the 8th lecture of the JP2 Lectures this academic year. This series is organized by the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, which is part of our Faculty of Philosophy here at the Angelicum in Rome. This lecture, as well as the entire JP2 Lecture series, could not have taken place without the support of our university authorities. Father Thomas Joseph White, the Rector of Angelicum, and Father Serge Thomas Bonino, the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy, whom I would like to thank. Special thanks also in order for the founders of St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, donors and supporters of St. John Paul II Institute of Culture, our audience and all viewers in front of the screens. We are glad to be finally able to meet you in person. We would also like to warmly welcome Cardinal James Michael Harvey and Cardinal George Pearl, who have honored us with their presence today. The St. John Paul II Institute of Culture was established to look at the challenges facing the modern world and the Church in light of the life and thought of St. John Paul II. The idea of thinking with John Paul II was embodied in the JP2 Lectures series, which are monthly lectures of eminent interdisciplinary academics who will revisit the extraordinary contribution of John Paul II for our new day. Last month, at the 7th JP2 Lectures this academic year, we had the honor of hosting Professor Eva Thompson, who in her lecture undertook the critique the category of Eastern Europe and replaced it with the concept of a non-Germanic Central Europe. Eva Thompson pointed out how attitudes to the Christianity differ between North-Germanic Central Europe and its neighbors, and argued how Europe could benefit from deepening research into the experience and knowledge of this region. In the final upcoming lecture of our series planned for this academic year, 2021-2022, we will host Professor Stanisław Grygel. Now, I'm pleased to give the floor to Dr. Dariusz Karłowicz, the initiator of the JP2 Lectures series, philosopher, president of St. Nicholas Foundation, strategic partner of the Institute, and the St. John Paul II Institute of Culture Program Director. Dariusz Karłowicz will share more about our today's special guest.
Good afternoon, dear friends. I'm honored to introduce to you George Weigel, American philosopher and theologian, author of 20 books, among them the famous, very well-known biography of St. John Paul II in 2 volumes. The first name was Witness to Hope, and the second, The End of the Beginning. He's a distinguished senior fellow and chair of Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. George Weigel has received 18 honorary doctorate degrees, as well as the Papal Cross Pro Ecclesia at Pontifice and the Gloria Artis Gold Medal from the Polish Ministry of Culture. George Weigel will begin his lecture by asking about the historical and ideological origins of the policy of appeasement that we can observe in the attitude of the Catholic Church towards non-democratic states in the eastern part of our globe. Professor Weigel will explore the theory behind the Vatican Ostpolitik of the 60s and 70s, its effects on the Church in East Central Europe and in the Vatican, and the distinctive statecraft of John Paul II. Professor Weigel will present the lessons of the pontificate of John Paul II, who rightly stressed that he was neither a diplomat nor a politician. Instead, he was a shepherd who, in the exercise of his pastoral duties, had certain truths to communicate to the world of the politics. Professor Weigel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dariusz. Dziękuję. Grazie. Good afternoon to everyone. I think we should begin by noting that today is the 102nd anniversary of the birth of St. John Paul II. So let's put our reflections this afternoon under his intercession as we reflect upon some of his many accomplishments in 26 and a half years of his pontificate. I too want to thank the Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas and its leaders, Theologia Polityczna in Warsaw, the two institutions that have made my presence here possible, not only for this lecture, but in courses in December and now in May. Greet my friends Cardinal Harvey and Cardinal Pell, Ambassador Antonio Zanardi Landi, Professor Stanisław Grigiel and his lovely wife. And I want to say a special word of welcome to those in Ukraine who are watching this lecture by live stream this afternoon. I was in touch with some of them earlier this morning, and I want to offer them a word of solidarity and commendation, particularly at the Ukrainian Catholic University, for the extraordinary work they have been doing over the past 3 very, very challenging months. For the past 5 years, Catholics and friendly observers of the global Catholic scene have been puzzled, and some have been deeply disturbed by Vatican concessions to the People's Republic of China that have given the Chinese Communist Party a significant role in the appointment of Catholic bishops in the PRC. Those concessions have been made to a regime whose totalitarian character has been underscored by its stated determination to sinicize all religions, thus subordinating them to the party state, by its internal handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, which it likely caused and certainly exacerbated, by its systematic violation of treaty-guaranteed civil liberties in Hong Kong, and by its genocide of the Muslim Uyghurs. In light of these realities, certain important questions have been raised. Why would the Vatican trust any agreement co-signed by a totalitarian power, given its previous experience with Mussolini and Hitler, both of whom blatantly ignored the provisions of concordats they had concluded with the Holy See? Why have warnings within China about the negative impact of the current Vatican-China rapprochement on Chinese Catholics who have remained loyal to Rome at considerable cost been dismissed or ignored? Why would the Church why would the Church violate its own canon law, according to which no rights or privileges of election, appointment, presentation, or designation of bishops are conceded to civil authorities in this matter? And what motivates the dogged pursuit by professional Holy See diplomats of full diplomatic exchange at the ambassadorial level between the Holy See and the PRC? Finding answers to these questions requires 3 steps back. First to 1870, then to 1929, and then to 1962. In 1870, when the forces of the Risorgimento captured Rome and made it the capital of a unified Italy, the last vestiges of the Papal States disappeared, and Pope Pius IX retired behind the Leonine Wall, styling himself the prisoner of the Vatican. Even as the Holy See maintained its international legal personality and continued to send and receive diplomatic representatives, Pius IX's three successors tried in vain to reach an agreement with the new Italian state that would guarantee the Pope's independence from all earthly powers. That goal was achieved by Pope Pius XI in the 1929 Lateran Accords, which created what we know as Vatican City-State, guaranteed its sovereign independence, and acknowledged the new microstate's unfettered control of several extraterritorial properties. Yet many of the Holy See's diplomats seem to me, at least, not to have grasped the full implications of the Lateran Accords. Rather, these foreign policy professionals continued to think that the new Holy See Vatican City was essentially the equivalent of the old Holy See Papal States, a third-tier European power that could nonetheless exert diplomatic leverage on occasion, as it did, for example, at the Congress of Vienna. And as Italy, while becoming an economic dynamo, became less of a consequential actor in world politics, it was natural for Italian papal diplomats to seek some significant role for Rome on the global stage. Then came October 1962. It has been insufficiently remarked that the opening of the Second Vatican Council, the most important event in Catholic history since the various reformations of the 16th century, coincided precisely with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Pope John XXIII and the Vatican's diplomatic service were sufficiently shaken by the geopolitical trauma of a world poised on the knife's edge of nuclear war, just as the Council was opening, that a profound redirection of Vatican diplomacy toward the European communist world was devised. This became known as the Ostpolitik, and its principal agent was a highly regarded Vatican diplomat, Archbishop Agostino Casaroli. Casaroli's Ostpolitik, which unfolded during the pontificate of Pope Paul VI, aimed at finding what Casaroli called a modus non moriendi, a way of not dying for the Catholic Church behind the Iron Curtain. And that meant reaching agreements with communist regimes on the appointment of bishops. In order to appoint bishops who could ordain priests and thus maintain the Church's sacramental life under atheist regimes, the Vatican ended the anti-communist rhetoric that had characterized its public diplomacy in the 1950s. It removed several senior churchmen who refused to concede anything to communist governments. It discouraged any public role for exiled Catholic leaders like Ukrainian Cardinal Joseph Slipyj, and it counseled underground Catholic clergy and laity behind the Iron Curtain to cease or at least mute their resistance to their local communist regimes. One premise informing this dramatic transition in the Holy See's diplomatic strategy and tactics was the notion that the sharp anti-communist rhetoric of Pius XI and Pius XII's 1949 excommunication of Catholics cooperating with communist parties or regimes had been partially to blame for the communist persecution of the Church. The theory was that if the Vatican showed itself more accommodating, the buzzword was dialogue, such mellowness would be reciprocated. It was not. And by any objective measure, the Casaroli Ostpolitik was a failure that in several cases made matters worse. In Rome, it led to the serious penetration of the Vatican by East Bloc intelligence services with agents sporting such exotic code names as Pietro, Heinal, and Lichtblick. That counterintelligence debacle, now well documented from primary sources, and which I discussed at some length in the end and the beginning, had numerous unhappy effects. For example, it put the diplomats of the Ostpolitik in an even weaker position vis-à-vis their communist counterparts, because Warsaw Pact representatives frequently knew the Holy See's negotiating position before the negotiation began, thanks to the work of well-placed moles and informers inside the Roman Curia and elsewhere. In countries that were the Ostpolitik's intended beneficiaries, there were no improvements of consequence as a result of Archbishop Casseroli's shuttle diplomacy, and in some instances the Church's position was further weakened. The Hungarian Catholic hierarchy became a wholly owned subsidiary of the Hungarian state, which meant the Hungarian Communist Party. Repression increased in what was then Czechoslovakia, with regime-friendly fake Catholic organizations given public prominence, while underground bishops and priests worked as janitors, window washers, and elevator repairmen, conducting clandestine ministries at night. The Ostpolitik did nothing to improve the situation of Catholics in the Soviet Union. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church remained the world's largest illegal religious community, tenaciously maintaining itself underground through clandestine institutions, and Lithuanian Catholic resistance leaders found themselves doing hard time in gulag camps. The Ostpolitik had no serious effect in Poland, however. There, the wily primate, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski, and the charismatic Archbishop of Krakow, Cardinal Karol Wojtyła, spoke politely with visiting Vatican diplomats and then returned to the business of strengthening the most vigorous Catholic community in the Soviet sphere. When Wojtyła was elected Pope in 1978, one facet of the Casseroli Ostpolitik was buried, as John Paul conducted a vocal human rights campaign that was instrumental in igniting the revolution of conscience that shaped the revolution of 1989 and the self-liberation of East Central Europe from communism. Two lessons ought to have been learned from this. First, and whatever its good intentions, the Ostpolitik was a failure because the appeasement of communist regimes never works. And it never works because of the nature of those regimes and their commitment to what the Polish security service, the Służba Bezpieczeństwa, called the disintegration of the Catholic Church. In fact, the SB, the Polish security service, had an entire department, 4D, I believe, dedicated to the disintegration of the Catholic Church. The second lesson that ought to have been learned is that the real authority of the Holy See and that the real authority of the Holy See and the Pope have in modern and postmodern worlds is moral authority. And that moral authority, a form of soft power, as it's known in international relations theory, can be deployed with real effect, as we learned from the extraordinary impact of John Paul II's first papal pilgrimage to Poland in June 1979. Those lessons were not learned by the heirs of Cardinal Casseroli, however, many of whom are influential figures in Vatican diplomacy today. Thus, at Rome's Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy, the Ostpolitik is still presented to future Vatican diplomats as a model of success. And there seems to have been no intellectual reckoning with the abundant evidence demonstrating the failures of Casseroli's diplomacy at any level of the Secretariat of State of the Holy See. This unwillingness to grasp the lessons of the failures of the 1970s unfortunately continues today, and it has seriously diminished the moral authority of the Vatican and the Catholic Church in world arenas, where the Holy See is increasingly regarded, alas, as simply another international non-governmental organization. Over the past 9 years, the methods of the Karol Ostpolitik have been deployed once again as the Vatican has tried to open dialogues with Bashar al-Assad, Nicolas Maduro, Daniel Ortega, and Rosario Murillo, the post-Castro Cuban leadership, and now Vladimir Putin and his ecclesiastical consort, Patriarch Kirill of Moscow and all Rus. Concurrently, the transformative achievements of John Paul II and his charismatic moral leadership are being misconceived in some quarters here in Rome as the fruit of Karol's Ostpolitik, or ignored by the Vatican senior diplomats, or both. Most recently, the return of the Karol approach has led to a sense of abandonment among Ukrainian Catholics who recognize and lament the chimerical character of the stated intention of Vatican diplomacy to position itself as a broker between Ukraine and Russia. Despite, or perhaps because of, this reluctance to reckon with the old Ostpolitik's failures and the failures of the revived Ostpolitik approach in Syria, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, China, Russia, and elsewhere, there remains much to be learned from the statecraft of John Paul II. Now, to be sure, in canonizing the Polish Pope, the Catholic Church was not recommending him as a model of statesmanship. For example, as later generations of scholars and political leaders might lift up George Marshall or Alcide de Gasperi as such models. Still, John Paul II's heroic exercise of the chief virtue of statecraft, which is, of course, prudence, contains important lessons for those seeking to advance the peace of security, freedom, and order in world politics today. John Paul II always insisted correctly that he was neither diplomat nor politician. He was rather a pastor who, in exercising his pastoral responsibilities, had things to say to the world of political power. Why? Because the things he said had to do with the Church's defense of human dignity, the protection of which gives the exercise of public authority what Aristotle might have called its distinctive excellence, and what the Second Vatican Council described as one of public authority's fundamental moral purposes. Yet this Polish-born pastor, who refused to don the mantle of politician or diplomat, choosing instead the role of moral witness, was the most politically consequential pope in centuries, a pope whose evangelically inspired action changed history and left a deep impression on the future. Thus, the footprints of his distinctive statecraft can be found all over the world. In Central and Eastern Europe, which he helped liberate from communism, in Latin America, Asia, and Africa, where men and women formed by John Paul II's social doctrine are striving to make freedom for excellence work in the political and economic fields. In the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, where John Paul II's robust defense of religious freedom as the first of human rights has taken on new and perhaps unexpected salience in postmodern societies threatened by what Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger called in April 2005 the dictatorship of relativism. The responsibilities of a pope and the responsibilities of presidents, prime ministers, foreign ministers, and diplomats are not identical. Popes no longer deploy hard power in the form of armies as they once did. Democratic leaders charged with the defense of the common good must calculate the interests of the people they represent and serve in ways that popes don't, which is to say that popes and public officials deal with international politics out of different toolkits. Still, in this season in which things seem to be becoming unhinged, and the West struggles to fulfill its role as the guarantor of a measure of decency and order in world affairs, it is worth considering what statesmen who seek to defend freedom and human rights, especially against aggressor states who care for neither, might learn from the distinctive global statecraft of a saint who had a real impact on what pundits like to call the real world. 7 such lessons suggest themselves. The first lesson, culture comes first. Culture comes first. John Paul II's statecraft rejected the fallacies that had made political modernity a slaughterhouse. He rejected the Jacobin fallacy, born in 1789, that history is driven by politics, understood as the quest for power, with power being understood as my ability to impose my will on you. He rejected the Marxist fallacy, that history is merely the exhaust fumes of the means of production. And he rejected the liberal fallacy that if a society only gets the machinery of democracy and the free economy right, those machines can run by themselves. Rather, drawing on both Catholic and Polish sources, John Paul II insisted that culture was, is, and always will be the most dynamic force in history, both positively, in terms of building and sustaining free societies, and, if you will, defensively, in terms of resisting tyranny. Moreover, he understood that at the center of culture is cult, or religion, what people believe, cherish, and worship, what people are willing to stake their lives and their children's lives on. This culture-first approach to history and statecraft was on full display during John Paul's epic first pilgrimage to Poland, 9 days in June 1979, on which the history of the 20th century pivoted in a fundamental way. What have become known as simply the 9 days of John Paul II are sometimes described as a moment of national catharsis, and there's something to that. The pent-up frustrations, sorrows, and angers engendered by Poland's awful experience over 2 centuries, its vivisection in the late 18th century, its demolition by Nazis and its desecration by communists, began to be healed by the triumphant return of Poland's papal son to his homeland. But a lot more went on during those 9 days than catharsis. What happened was transformation, the revitalization of a culture in a revolution of conscience, ignited by John Paul II's summons to the people he knew so well. You are not who they say you are. Reclaim who you really are. Own the truth of your history and your culture, and you will find tools of resistance that communism cannot match. I might note parenthetically here that a similar dynamic was at work in Ukraine during the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2013-2014, with results that have amazed the world since the Russian invasion of February 24th. The 9 days of John Paul II in June 1979 were arguably the most politically consequential and potent papal intervention in world affairs since the High Middle Ages. Yet during those 9 days, the Pope did not mention politics or economics once, nor did he engage in negotiations with the public authorities, whom he largely ignored except for brief pro forma ceremonies when he arrived in Warsaw on June 2nd and left from Krakow on June 10th. Rather, John Paul spoke the truth of Poland's history, culture, and national understanding in dozens of variations on one great theme. By returning to his people the truth about themselves, he helped them forge tools of liberation that were essentially moral and cultural in nature. Deployed over a hard decade of struggle that led to the triumphs of the Revolution of 1989, those tools proved more than adequate in answering Stalin's cynical question, the Pope, how many divisions does he have? Excuse me. The second lesson, ideas count for good and for ill. Ideas count for good and for ill. I doubt that John Paul II ever read John Maynard Keynes, but he certainly understood the truth of what that Cambridge economist meant when Keynes wrote this: both when they are right and when they are wrong, ideas are more powerful than is commonly understood. In fact, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Soon or late, it is ideas which are dangerous for good or evil. John Paul knew the dangers of false ideas from hard experience. Living in what Timothy Snyder has aptly dubbed the bloodlands of East Central Europe, he had seen the lethal effects of Lenin's, Stalin's, and Hitler's wicked ideas in the deaths of tens of millions of human beings, including his friends and classmates. But he also knew from experience the regenerative power of noble ideas. For example, the ideas of Christian democracy formulated by Jacques Maritain, Luigi Sforza, and Etienne Gilson, and then deployed by Konrad Adenauer, de Gasperi, and Schumann in building post-war Europe. In both cases, the wicked, false, and death-dealing ideas and the good, true, and ennobling ideas, what was most crucial in John Paul II's view was the idea of the human person being proposed. Or to use a social science term in its philosophical sense, what counted was anthropology. And here we find the connection between Karol Wojtyła, Polish philosopher, and John Paul II, statesman. In the first decades of his pontificate, John Paul II, statesman, saw that the Yalta division of Europe was not only wrong, but fragile and unsustainable, because Karol Wojtyła, Polish philosopher, knew that Stalin's power grab in the waning days of the Second World War was in service to a false idea of the human person, a warped anthropology that led inevitably, not accidentally, it led inevitably to the Gulag, the KGB, and the entire apparatus of Soviet repression. In the last years of his papacy, John Paul II, statesman, knew that 21st century Europe, and indeed the 21st century West, risked dissolving into incoherence because Karol Wojtyła, Polish philosopher, had accurately measured the deficiencies of the atheistic humanism and soul-withering secularism that were at the root of Western Europe's post-Cold War crisis of civilizational morale. Those who would learn from the example of John Paul II will therefore take ideas and the contest of ideas, the war of ideas, with as much seriousness as they take indices of gross national product or measures of military capability. Why? Because all three are connected. Neither wealth nor military power will be usefully deployed in the cause of freedom in the 21st century if the will to do so is not present. And it seems unlikely that the will to challenge the lies and propaganda of the forces of disorder, which is an essential component of restoring a measure of order in world affairs, will be formed if the political culture of the West continues to be eroded from within by skepticism, relativism, and irony, by an anthropology that reduces the human person to a mere bundle of desires, and by a nihilism that mocks all religious and moral conviction. Here, Ukraine has also provided an example that must be seriously pondered by the older democracies. The third lesson, don't psychologize the adversary. Don't psychologize the adversary. One result of the decline of philosophy and the parallel rise of social science in the late modern and postmodern West has been the emergence of psychological approaches to statecraft, as political theory has sadly disappeared from many university curricula, and political science has become a subset of statistics. In American terms, one can trace this back to the social science theories popular among the so-called best and brightest of the Kennedy-Johnson years. The mandarins who believed that a naval blockade of Cuba in 1962 was a form of communication, and who imagined that signaling North Vietnam by turning the spigot of air power on and off could change Ho Chi Minh's behavior. The Obama-era analog to this psychologization of statecraft was the strategy of reset, first with Russia and the Arab Islamic world, then with Cuba and Iran. The premise here was that bad actors behave badly because of what we do, so that if we behave differently, their behavior will change and become less disagreeable, if not downright praiseworthy. John Paul II knew this for the foolishness it was and is. As a keen student of the human condition, he understood that bad actors behave badly because of who they are, what they espouse, and what they seek, not because of anything we did to them. Thus, he could focus on the issues at hand, religious freedom and other basic human rights in the communist world, for example, without without tying himself up in knots over whether the Cold War division of Europe was somehow President Harry Truman's fault. That's great. Thank you. Unlike Western revisionist historians, John Paul II understood that Stalin, his heirs, and their Polish epigones did what they did because of who they were, what they believed, and what they sought, not because Uncle Joe Stalin had been gratuitously offended at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. The 21st century lessons to be drawn from this papal clarity about the sources of conflict should be obvious. To take one urgent case, Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing in Ukraine and what he previously did in Moldova, Georgia, Chechnya, and elsewhere, not because of anything Ukraine, Moldova, or other post-Soviet states did to him or to Russia, but because of who he is, what he believes, and what he seeks. Thus, narratives of the current war in Ukraine that seek to balance responsibility for the conflict or describe it as a civil war or fraternal conflict distort reality, and in doing so make creative and sensible policy virtually impossible. The same is true of the Shia totalitarians who hold ultimate authority in Tehran. Unless their behavior in seeking a nuclear capability is understood on its own terms, as an expression of their own apocalyptic ideas and ambitions, rather than as a reaction to pressures from the Sunni world, the West, or both, the world will remain vulnerable to Iranian dissembling and stalling, and the likelihood of an Iranian bomb will grow accordingly. The fourth lesson, speak loudly and be supple in deploying whatever sticks, large or small, you have at hand. When John Paul II was elected the 264th Bishop of Rome on October 16, 1978, Vatican diplomacy was well into the second decade of the Karol Ostpolitik, which, as noted before, avoided public condemnation of communism's human rights violations for the sake of reaching diplomatic agreements with Warsaw Pact countries. Those agreements were supposed to guarantee the Church's freedom to live its sacramental life by its own standard. They did not, and as I remarked earlier, the limited agreements that were achieved demoralized the Church in several East Bloc countries, did little to relieve the condition of Catholics throughout the Warsaw Pact and in the Soviet Union, and opened the Vatican to further penetration by communist intelligence services, a process that had begun in the early 1960s and that has yet to be acknowledged by the relevant authorities despite clear primary source evidence. Yet John Paul was shrewd enough not to dismantle the Ostpolitik completely or to publicly repudiate it. Rather, he made Archbishop Casseroli his Secretary of State, named him a cardinal, and gave him full rein to pursue his diplomacy east of the Elbe River. Thus, no communist leader could publicly accuse the Church of reneging on its previous commitments because of a reactionary Polish pope in league with NATO, although Soviet and East Bloc propaganda and disinformation campaigns worked overtime to sell precisely that message throughout the West, not without some success. Then, while Casseroli continued his bilateral diplomatic efforts, John Paul II restored the Church's voice in challenging human rights violations and calling upon communist states to honor their commitments under Basket 3 of the 1976 Helsinki Final Act, and he did so by making his own voice the Vatican's principal voice. Time and time again, in venue after venue, John Paul II lifted up the first freedom, religious freedom, and brought his case before the world in his 1979 address to the UN General Assembly. Because of that papal megaphone, the resistance church behind the Iron Curtain knew it had a champion. Those in the West committed to supporting the resistance church in Central and Eastern Europe were inspired to intensify their efforts, and all the while, the Soviet rationale for its social model was being systematically undercut in the order of ideas. The Polish Pope applied the same methods in his efforts to shore up those Catholic leaders working for justice and peace in Central America in the face of Marxist governments and insurgencies there. The communist tide began to recede in Central America when John Paul II vocally confronted the adolescent cheerleading of Daniel Ortega and his comrades at a 1983 papal mass in Managua, and the entire affair, including the Pope demanding silence from Ortega and company so that he could preach his sermon, was telecast throughout the region, thanks to the adroit work of the papal trip planner, Father Roberto Tucci. Yet John Paul was also willing to be the quiet persuader, working behind the scenes while local churchmen did the denouncing of injustice when that seemed appropriate, a method that worked well in Argentina, Chile, and the Philippines, as the Pope met with, and thus gave his tacit blessing to, local human rights activists and political reformers, while he worked privately on the Argentine military, on General Augusto Pinochet, and on President Fernando Marcos, urging them to respect human rights and restore democracy in their countries. Thus, the lesson for today: moral pressure can be an important lever in world politics, but effective human rights advocacy and defense of the libertas ecclesiae, the liberty of the church, require dexterity, diplomatic dexterity, and dexterity in waging the battle of ideas. The fifth lesson: listen to the martyrs. Listen to the martyrs. The Ostpolitik that guided Vatican diplomacy in Central and Eastern Europe between 1963 and 1978 did not disrespect the persecuted local churches behind the Iron Curtain, but it did tend to regard their intransigence as an obstacle to diplomatic accommodation between the Holy See and communist regimes. And such accommodations had to be reached, according to the Ostpolitik, because the Yalta division of Europe was a permanent reality of world affairs, not a temporary aberration. Thus, in the decade prior to John Paul's election, Pope Paul VI removed Cardinals Joseph Beran and Joseph Mindszenty from their posts in Prague and Budapest and kept the exiled leader of the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, Cardinal Joseph Slipyj, at a distance. John Paul II had long read the reality of the martyr confessors in the underground churches behind the Iron Curtain differently. To his mind, the witness of those brave men and women, living and dead, helped strengthen a religiously informed cultural resistance to communism because it embodied in a unique way the moral pressure that could and should be exerted on communist regimes. So, during his time as Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła clandestinely ordained priests for service in the underground church in Czechoslovakia in what amounted to a tacit challenge to the Vatican's Ostpolitik. As Pope, he made sure that the world, and especially the Kremlin, knew of his meeting with Ukrainian Cardinal Slipyj, leader of the largest underground church in the world, a month after John Paul's election. That meeting took place a few weeks after he had sent his Cardinal Zucchetto to the Ostra-Brahma shrine at Vilnius in Lithuania as a gesture of solidarity with another long-suffering and persecuted local church, a gesture that was repaid within weeks as the Lithuanian Committee for the Defense of Believers' Rights was formed and became one of the most dogged, persistent human rights proponents in the Soviet Union. This pattern continued throughout the pontificate and was not limited to the Pope's support for fellow Catholics. John Paul II deployed his own private contacts into the USSR to keep himself informed of the views of the human rights resistance there. One result of that clandestine papal intelligence operation was his December 1985 meeting in the Vatican with Elena Bonner, wife of Andrei Sakharov, which was arranged by one of John Paul's informal agents, Irina Alberti, former aide to Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his Vermont exile. For John Paul II, the witness of the modern martyr confessors deserved to be honored in its own right. Just as the church demeaned itself, he believed, when it accommodated the demands of totalitarian persecutors, so the church was strengthened by acknowledging the witness of its sons and daughters who took the risk of freedom and paid the price for it. Honoring the persecuted church also had an important effect on the Holy See's diplomatic action in world politics, John Paul seemed to think. It acted as a brake upon the realpolitik pragmatism that is common to many European foreign ministries, but that is neither realistic nor pragmatic over the long haul. There are lessons here for both statesmen and churchmen in dealing with such 21st century challenges as the transition to a post-communist future in Cuba, the rise of an assertive China, and finding the appropriate response to the lethal threats posed by jihadist Islam to Christian communities in the Middle East and Africa. Listening to the voices of the martyr confessors of these regions will clarify the obstacles to a better future in these difficult circumstances. Lifting up the witness of the living martyr confessors publicly and persistently might also afford them a measure of protection while helping sustain islands of civil society essential to future progress toward justice and peace in Cuba, China, the Middle East, and Africa. The sixth lesson: think long-term and do not sacrifice core principles to what may seem immediate advantage. In the mid-1980s, after martial law had been lifted in Poland, but while the Solidarity trade union was still legally banned, officials of General Wojciech Jaruzelski's communist regime quietly approached Polish church leaders with a proposal. The regime would open a national dialogue on Poland's future, and the church would act as the regime's interlocutor. Some Polish churchmen were tempted by that offer, but John Paul II refused to take the bait. Solidarity was the proper representative of Polish civil society in his view, and the church ought not substitute itself in that role, especially as that meant tacitly acquiescing to Solidarity's legal non-status. The church could help facilitate a conversation between the regime and the opposition, but the church should not replace the opposition. That decision had theological roots. In John Paul II's ecclesiology, the church could not be a partisan political actor because that contradicted the Eucharistic character of the church, a theme he stressed in challenging various forms of liberation theology in Latin America. It was also based on John Paul II's social doctrine. In that vision of the free and virtuous society, the church formed the people who formed the civil society and the political institutions that did the work of politics. The church as such was not a political agent, although the church obviously had a voice in civil society. In the event, the church's refusal to play opposition party to the leading role of the Communist Party in Poland increased the pressure on the Jaruzelski regime to recognize the real Polish opposition represented by Solidarity. Thus, John Paul II's principled decision helped create the conditions for the possibility of the Polish Roundtable of early 1989 and the partially free elections of June 1989. And those elections, by delivering an overwhelming victory to Solidarity, made possible the first non-communist government in Polish history in September 1989. The lesson here, I think, is that the cause of freedom and the cause of the church are best served when statesmen and churchmen think long-term and do not bracket or minimize core principles for what can seem to be immediate advantage. That lesson bears on the church's role in Cuba today, where local Catholic leaders' understandable concerns to strengthen the church's institutional infrastructure should go hand in hand with a vigorous defense of those dissidents who form the core of the Cuban civil society of the future. This sixth John Paul II lesson should also raise cautions about the Holy See's evident push for full diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. In the present circumstances, any such deal would require the Vatican to sever its diplomatic exchange with the Republic of China on Taiwan, the first Chinese democracy in history. What signal would such a deal at such a price send about the Catholic Church's vision of China's future? What signal would it send about the Church's concern for the hard-pressed and often persecuted elements of civil society that exist in China today and are pressing for a non-authoritarian and open future? The evangelical mission of the Church in the Cuba and the China of the future are not going to be materially advanced, is not going to be materially advanced by accommodating too easily to the regnant regimes in those countries. neither will the path beyond Castroite communism and China's totalitarianism. There are also lessons here for the Holy See's role in Ukraine. The long-standing Vatican priority given to cordial ecumenical relations with the Russian Orthodox Church must be re-examined in light of the unhappy fact, now made unmistakably clear, that the current Russian Orthodox leader, and specifically Patriarch Kirill and his chief ecumenical officer, Metropolitan Hilarion, function as tools of Russian state power, playing a tawdry role in Kremlin propaganda and disinformation campaigns, and blessing aggression in the name of a false rendering of the Christian history of the Eastern Slavs. Neither common ecumenical witness in defense of international legal norms nor serious theological dialogue is possible under those circumstances. Pretending otherwise merely reinforces the damage being done by aggressors. The seventh lesson. Media reality isn't necessarily reality, and the statesman cannot play acolyte to such narratives. The most unintentionally hilarious commentary on the public impact of John Paul II came from the editorial page of the New York Times. John Paul was in the middle of those epic 9 days of June 1979 when, on June 5th, the Times read an editorial on the papal pilgrimage with this conclusion, quote, "As much as the visit of Pope John Paul II to Poland must reinvigorate the Roman Catholic Church in Poland, it does not threaten the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe." Wrong. Why did the Times so badly miss the reality of what was afoot in Poland? In part, I suspect, because it regarded the Roman Catholic Church in Poland as of no more political consequence to the political order of the nation or of Eastern Europe than the Polish Flat Earth Society, which, come to think of it, is not a bad analog for the New York Times general view of the Catholic Church. Then there was the view in the progressive world, for which the Times was both mirror and infallible teaching authority, that the Cold War would be resolved when an increasingly social democratic West converged with a liberalizing East, and the Berlin Wall would simply dissolve. A narrative that was also popular in certain European and indeed Vatican circles. And then there was the Times' concern, shared by many foreign policy realists in the United States and Western Europe, that any disturbance of the Yalta post-war order threatened nuclear holocaust. So while it might be too bad for what were once called the captive nations, the way things were was the way things were going to have to be, lest greater demons be let loose. These narratives, the narrative of the political irrelevance of religion in the late 20th century, the narrative of convergence, and the change risks nuclear war narrative seemed to be reality. But they weren't reality. They were merely imitations or simulacra of reality. John Paul II was wise enough to know that and act according to what was really reality. The reality that a morally informed human rights resistance based on a clear and correct conception of the dignity of the human person attacked communism at its most vulnerable point and thus held one of the keys to settling the Cold War in favor of the forces of freedom and without mass violence. The problem of confusing reality with media reality or narrative has intensified since 1978 because of the ubiquity of social media and instant internet commentary, both of which readily create narratives that seem to be reality. Yet the statesmen of the 21st century would do well to take a lesson from John Paul II and read the signs of the times more acutely than is possible through lenses crafted by narrative. The same applies to churchmen. Church leaders, clerical and lay, who respond to media-generated narratives about the Catholic Church rather than to the imperatives of the gospel, are not going to advance the evangelical mission of the Church or the cause of human dignity and freedom. The gospel has power, and its power can cut through the densest of false narratives. Finally, what might be the lessons of the singular public effect of St. John Paul II for all of us? While there are many admirable qualities in the life of John Paul II that we would all do well to emulate, what is perhaps most compelling and inspiring at this historical moment is his refusal to submit to what I call the tyranny of the possible. The great hopes that followed the revolution of 1989, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the various color revolutions in the post-communist world, and the Arab Spring have often been frustrated. History is manifestly not over, and the forces that stand for ordered liberty in the world seem to be in retreat. Too much of Latin America has reverted to chronic patterns of corruption and authoritarianism, or corruption and incompetence, or corruption, incompetence, and authoritarianism. While much of Europe has shown admirable grit in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's brutal war there, Western Europe remains bedeviled by a deficit in civilizational morale that only the willfully ignorant or fanatically secular will fail to recognize as a spiritual crisis in its deepest roots. That religious freedom has come under assault in the West within two decades of its vindication in the formerly communist world was not something that many expected in 1989 or at the turn of the millennium, for that matter. What Pope Francis has aptly described as a throwaway culture in which the disposable are not just consumer goods but people is eroding the moral fabric of our civilization. Drastically different ideas of the human person, human community, and human destiny are in conflict throughout the Western world. At such a moment, it is imperative that we take a lesson from John Paul II and not bind ourselves with the self-imposed shackles of low expectations, submitting to the tyranny of the possible as the conventional wisdom of the day defines what is possible. Had Karol Wojtyła, on becoming John Paul II, accepted the conventional wisdom of the moment, he would have settled down to manage the inevitable decline of the Catholic Church in a world permanently divided along geopolitical and ideological fault lines defined in the 1940s. Because he believed more deeply and thus saw more clearly. He discerned sources of renewal in the church where others saw only decay, and he saw openings for freedom where others only saw impenetrable walls. By refusing to bend to the tyranny of the possible, he helped make what seemed impossible not only possible, but real. Events proved that his signature challenge on October 22, 1978, "Be not afraid," was not romanticism. It was the deepest, truest realism. Or as he put it to thousands of young people in Krakow in June 1979, as they gathered with him near the site of the martyrdom of St. Stanisław, "Be afraid only of thoughtlessness and pusillanimity." Be afraid only of thoughtlessness and pusillanimity. The world would do well to heed that summons and that challenge, which the Holy See would be in a unique position to proclaim were it to learn the appropriate lessons from the failures of the 1970s Ostpolitik and the statecraft of a saint. Thank you.
Professor Weigel, thank you very much for this exquisite lecture. And now we still have time for a couple of questions, so please use the mic.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk. I had a question about an issue that you touched upon, but I don't think you referenced directly. And that is that it seems to me that many, or a big part of the role that John Paul II played in the political realm of his time, or in the diplomatic realm of his time, had to do with the fact that he was a Polish pope during a time in which the epicenter of diplomatic and political conflict was Eastern Europe. And obviously that is a slightly different situation to, say, a German pope in a time in which the epicenter of political and international conflict might be between America and various terrorist organizations in the early 2000s. So he had the, I guess, privilege of knowing the situation he was dealing with very well. And a lot of people, a lot of popes, but a lot of diplomats also don't necessarily have that privilege. How do you think sort of contextual knowledge fits into the framework you've described?
Thanks. Thank you, Alessandro. That's a very good question. The fact that John Paul II applied essentially the same methodology in Central and Eastern Europe to Latin America, East Asia, and elsewhere suggests that the template of statecraft that he operated within, which I really do want to stress was essentially ecclesiological in character. I mean, this was a function of his way of thinking of the church and the role of the office of Peter in the church. That template had something of a universal character to it. Now, I once, when I was working on Witness to Hope, we were at dinner, and the Pope said, as he often did, "What are you learning about me now?" And I said, I'm very struck by the parallels between your pastoral program in Krakow as Archbishop and what you have done for the first 15 years of your pontificate. Which point then Monsignor Dziwisz bursts in and says, of course, it's the same man. But the Pope had a different answer. He said, if the Holy Spirit saw fit to bring the Archbishop of Krakow to be the Bishop of Rome, that must mean there was something in the experience of Krakow that was useful for the Universal Church. And I think that confidence in the providential guidance of his own life, which was the result of an intense spiritual life, not without its dark nights, was another major factor in this. What seems to me clear in the retrospect of 17 years that was very important for him is that he trusted on-the-ground knowledge, data, information from people who were there in situations rather than this, what we now call narratives. And that turned out to be a very useful tool. And of course, the sources of that information were not just people working behind the scenes. They were his nuncios and their staffs in various countries. But he was not given to thinking as the conventional wisdom would have him think. I think his own on-the-ground experience in June 1979 made a dramatic difference. I do not think he came to Rome in October 78 thinking communism has 10 years to run and I'm going to accelerate the process. I don't think he thought that. I think the experience of those 9 days in June 79, which not only included Poles, but people from all over Central and Eastern Europe, including security service agents from all over Central and Eastern Europe, gave him the idea that this emperor had fewer clothes than we might think.
I appreciate very much your talk, Dr. Weigel. I just have kind of a question about, you mentioned that the experience we've had with some of these perhaps communist nations or these other, maybe the Nazis, should have taught us that they don't always keep their word. They don't always keep these contracts or pacts that they make, and that the Vatican or some of the Vatican hierarchy have not learned this lesson. But isn't it the case that anytime you enter into a contract or a pact, there's always at the basis of this bona fide, that is, you're assuming that the person is going to fulfill what they say they're going to fulfill, that they're not just simulating, not just saying this, and they're going to do something opposite. So given that that's at the basis of almost every pact or contract, doesn't it make sense that the Holy See would make these concessions and that the other side would also make concessions and they would assume that these were going to be fulfilled? I mean, where's the what's the solution if you've had this bad experience? I mean, they haven't always, some of these other regimes have not always failed to fulfill, have they? I mean, you never know that this might be your lucky day when they do fulfill what they said they're going to fulfill in these arrangements and agreements.
We have a somewhat different understanding of contract, I think. When the United States and Canada make a trade agreement, there's pretty clear confidence on both sides of the 49th parallel that everybody's going to stick to the deal and do what they said they were going to do. When I buy a car, the car has a warranty attached to it as part of the contract of purchase that guarantees I'm not being sold a lemon. I suppose the difference yes, I mean, sure, original sin affects everything, and trust but verify, as President Reagan used to say, is a wise diplomatic policy. The difference with communist regimes is that it is in their nature to lie. Communism is a culture of lies. I mean, Solzhenitsyn wrote libraries about this. John Paul II understood this. The human rights resistance in Central and Eastern Europe during the 1970s and 80s, which created that marvelous phrase, living in the truth, as the antidote to what? The communist culture of the lie. That great political essay by Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless, is an extensive reflection on this dynamic. So I think one would be very, very well advised to be extremely cautious about contractual relationships with regimes whose very nature involves lying. I mean, China's been lying about COVID for 2 years now. I mean, why would you trust to deal with a regime like that? I mean, you may have to do some business with them, but you should do it with a very clear view of what the character of that regime is.
Thank you, Professor Weigel. You made a passing remark on jihadism. And I come from Nigeria, where in the far north, that is very strong. Some of you might have seen what took place on Saturday in the city of Sokoto. I'm wondering how the statecraft of John Paul II can be applied to jihadism in West Africa, particularly in Nigeria. Now, I put a footnote to that question. Interestingly, when Pope John Paul II first visited Nigeria in 1982, he was invited by the great-grandson of the jihadist himself, Usman Dan Fodio, who received him very well.
Yeah. Father, let me begin by thanking you for your essay in the Lamb and Levering commentary on Vatican II, which I leaned on heavily in my own new book on Vatican II coming. I'm delighted to meet you at last. Jihadism, whether in Nigeria or anywhere else, presents a very specific and disturbing set of problems. And the Nigerian situation, which seems, from what little I know, to be one in which the government has no real capacity to get control over on Boko Haram, makes matters particularly difficult. At the root of the jihadist phenomenon, I argued in a little book on the subject 15 years ago, is a false theology of God. God as will, God who can will anything, including willing Boko Haram to kidnap 200 schoolgirls and turn them into slaves or whatever. Whatever dialogue is possible with the non-jihadist parts of the Islamic world seems to me ought to begin at that point. Ought to begin at a mutual understanding of the roots of our differences, including our seeming inability to live together peacefully. Another just brief thought on that. The Catholic Church took 200 years at least to develop from within its own theological resources a theory of religious freedom and the pluralistic society. Okay, it took us 200 years to do that. We finally did it, and we did it not as a concession to John Locke. We did it out of our own theological toolkit. The question we should be posing with Islamic interlocutors, and which I tried to do here in this city about 5 years ago, with Muslims from Indonesia, Malaysia, and some of the less fevered parts of the Islamic world, was, do you have those resources in your perhaps less theological but legal toolkit, scriptural toolkit, in your lives of the saints, so that you can develop from within Islamic resources, Islamic sources, an Islamic theory of religious freedom and toleration, at least to the point of acknowledging the fundamental human right of religious freedom and acknowledging that to change one's religion, one's religious location ought not be a capital offense, ought not be a crime. That's probably going to be a 200-year process. And there's no getting around that I can see. And I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I really am not sure what the answer to that is. But those are two things that occur to me in that. Thank you.
Excuse me, my question will be a small metaphysical question, but united with many things you have said to us in your conference. Therefore, I dare to put it to you. You know, it is clear for me that the diplomacy between the states is not a pastoral work. But in the case of Holy See, the problem is quite different. The diplomacy should be the pastoral work as well. Also. Therefore, I ask you, can the Holy See, doing the diplomacy with some state, preside, abstract from the suffering of the people that is between Holy See and this country, for example, Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, between Vatican and Moscow, immediately after the Second World War. Now, the diplomacy and the Ukraine involved in the diplomacy of Vatican with Moscow, Hong Kong and China. I can remember you one thing that is unknown by many people. After the aggression, German-Russian aggression of Poland in 1939, the Pope pronounced for the first time the suffering of Polish people after the Battle of Stalingrad in 1943. Not before. Before, in the message of Christmas in 1939, when he spoke about the small country aggressed by another country, then the Polish government thanked Holy See that he has mentioned the Polish suffering. But 3 months after this Christmas message, the Holy Father explained to Ribbentrop that he thought not Poland, but Finland aggressed by Soviet Union in 1939. And now, you know, I remember, excuse me this, my memory. In the 70s, I met one of the special nonces of Vatican in Krakow, and this meeting was organized by the Cardinal Wojtyła. We were only the Cardinal, this nonce and me, and one another person. And I asked it. I put the question to this special nonce. Do you see, looking at the tower in Zagorsk, do you see the tower in Częstochowa? And he looked at me and answered, you are doing the aggression against me. You are accusing me. No, I ask you only. The answer can be to be accused or not. Afterwards, touching this problem, Cardinal Wojtyła told me, that is a big question. They do not understand us. And now, you know, this is the question for me. Can I follow the declaration of Vatican diplomacy, Vatican's diplomacy, in which they abstract the diplomats, Vatican diplomats, abstract from the suffering of the people, tending towards, I do not know what, an agreement, ecumenism, I do not know, the peace or peace, peace, yeah. Peace, 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 peace. Because I do not feel myself obliged to follow such declaration. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, I think it is, for the reasons I said here, Stanisław, I think it is wrong to prescind from the suffering of the people of the Church when the Holy See engages diplomatically, because A, it's wrong in itself, and B, it doesn't work. I mean, ignoring that doesn't get you anywhere. It usually leads you down a bad track in terms of negotiation. About a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, a senior Ukrainian churchman said to another senior Ukrainian churchman, who said to me, "Why aren't we applying to this horrible situation?" I mean, at this point, Mariupol was just being destroyed and whatnot. What we learned the hard way about responding to the abuse crisis. The victim comes first. You listen to the victim. There is zero tolerance of aggression, abusive behavior, and whatnot. And only after you've ticked those boxes do you get to negotiation. That was an interesting analogy, I thought. But and I think this goes back to this problem that I discussed at the beginning. And that is the Holy See in the 21st century deploys only moral power. It's the only power it has. It's the power of moral witness. Moral witness begins with telling the truth. Telling the truth can clear the air and create the ground for a serious conversation or negotiation, but you've got to tell the truth. So I think there's a whole rethinking that is required here so that we finally acknowledge that we're not dealing with the papal states here. This is not the Congress of Vienna. That's not that world. This is not the entity that represents the Church in those circumstances. And this needs a lot of careful rethinking. But we now have a lot of material to work with in these 7 lessons, and I'm sure there are more that others could identify, that we didn't have 25, 30 years ago. So that's my point in trying to draw these things out. I'm not interested in embarrassing anybody or settling historical scores. I want us to get this right in the future, and precisely for the sake of the integrity of the Church.
Professor Weigel, once again, thank you very much. I'm especially grateful because of your lectures in our institute and because of this talk. Once again, thanks a lot. I'd like to thank you to all here in Angelicum and all viewers in front of the screens. And I would like to invite you to the next talk by Professor Stanisław Weigel, who is with us today, which will take place on June 9th in Aula number 11. And also Dr. Dariusz has one more information.
share let me please share the information which I consider as very important for the Institute of Culture. With Professor Weigel lecture, we are going to finish the second year of JP2 Lectures in our institute. And we have already a first volume published in English of our JP2 Lectures from the first year. The name of that series, that's a motto of the Institute, Thinking with John Paul II. And I really appreciate because on the cover page we see the names of a very important Catholic thinker, starting with Gianfranco Ravasi, John Finnis, Rowan Williams, Marek Cichocki, John Cavadini, François Daguet, Chantal Del Sol, Remy Braque, Renato Christine, and Dariusz Gawin. And when you follow that year lecture, you know that a coming volume will be at least the same impressing. Thank you very much for that, and let me invite you for a Karol Wojtyła job, a performance conducted by a student of our institute in the Church of San Domenico and Sisto, our academic church. Very important performance. That's a first drama written by Karol Wojtyła. I may say, thinking about the context in which was that play created in the 1940, that becomes again very actual. So please feel welcome into the church. Thank you.
6:30, and the last information, everyone interested in further discussion with Professor Weigel is invited to tomorrow's open seminar, which will take place at 11 a.m. in Aula number 5. The seminar will focus on the issue of a just war and the limits of ecumenism. Thank you very much.
If there are any friends from the media here who would like a copy of the text, they're up here.